with Kat and the committee. And I welcome you all to write notes of encouragement in the chat if that's what you want to do. And with no further ado, I don't think we have any more questions to deal with before that. I will introduce Kat so we can get going. So Kat comes to us with a master's in fisheries and aquatic sciences and a BS in wildlife ecology and conservation. And she's also got a graduate certificate in epidemiology. And she also has worked in the public health field, focusing on mosquito-borne diseases in Florida by working through the Department of Health at Anastasia Mosquito Control District. So today she's going to talk to us about work she's been focusing on over the last 4 years in the QDEC group, leveraging mosquito surveillance and epidemiological data to inform public health response, a spatial statistics framework for arbovirus management and vector control in Ecuador.
Thank you, Dr. That title is a mouthful, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Okay, hello, and thank everyone for coming. This morning, I'm going to be giving an overview of my dissertation work from the last 4 years, where I use spatial analyses to further our understanding of mosquito-borne arbovirus risk and vector control issues in the South American country of Ecuador. Before I delve into the bulk of the research, I wanted to provide a brief overview of arthropod-borne viruses or arboviruses in Ecuador. Many of the arboviruses of public health concern in Ecuador are transmitted by mosquitoes and pose a major threat to public health in Latin America. The Pan American Health Organization in 2019 reported over 3 million cases of dengue in Latin America alone. These diseases can be very difficult to detect and treat, in part due to limited options for clinical care, but also because of resource constraints on diagnostic testing. When we're measuring the burden or the impact of these diseases, we tend to measure morbidity or the number of people who get sick. But there are also severe economic consequences, including lost wages due to prolonged illnesses and increased burdens on public health infrastructure that also should be included when we're talking about the burden that these diseases pose on different communities. This picture here is not in Ecuador. This is a children's dengue ward in Thailand, but it really, I think, goes to show the incredible burden on public health infrastructure that these diseases can have if outbreaks go unmitigated. Some of the arboviral diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes in Ecuador do include dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and yellow fever virus. I'm going to talk a little bit more about dengue fever because that is the mosquito-borne disease that most of this research focuses on. And dengue fever does impose an incredible burden on communities throughout Ecuador. PAHO confirmed over 11,000 cases of dengue in Ecuador in the year 2017. And last year, PAHO also estimated the burden to be very high in Ecuador with just under 17,000 cases. Part of what makes dengue so difficult to manage is the fact that there are 4 serotypes or distinct genetic strains of the virus. And if you contract one strain of dengue and recover from it, you will have immunity to that particular serotype, but still be susceptible to infection from the other 3 serotypes. Subsequent infections do run the risk of developing the severe form of the disease, dengue hemorrhagic fever. Dengue causes flu-like illness, with a characteristic rash, fever, and nausea. Another telltale symptom of this disease is severe joint pain, leading to another common name for dengue, breakbone fever. If you do develop one of the severe cases, so dengue hemorrhagic fever, some of the symptoms associated with that syndrome are leaky capillaries and blood vessels, which can result in severe bruising, shock, and greater chance of death. There is no widely available vaccine on the market to mitigate dengue or offer protection against dengue. So we're really left with managing the mosquito vector of the disease to control outbreaks. Aedes aegypti, or the yellow fever mosquito, is the primary vector of public health concern in Ecuador. It is an anthropophilic mosquito, meaning that it preferentially uses humans as hosts for taking blood meals, which also is part of the reason why it's such an efficient vector of so many human diseases. As an ectothermic organism, nearly every aspect of the mosquito's life history is mediated in some way by temperature. This includes several life history traits such as biting rates, flight, reproduction, and even development of pathogens inside of the mosquitoes. Water availability is also a very important consideration for this mosquito's reproduction. As a container breeding mosquito, Aedes aegypti oviposits or lays its eggs in standing water. And as you can see in this image taken in an urban center in Ecuador, urban environments can easily provide ample habitat capable of producing lots of mosquitoes, because any surface capable of holding water turns into a container that this mosquito can exploit for reproduction. Because the options for direct management of mosquito-borne diseases in Ecuador is limited, if we want to control the disease, then we need to control the mosquito. This figure, taken from Googler 1998, shows the previous success of coordinated vector control efforts throughout Central and South America, where by the 1950s, Aedes aegypti was extirpated throughout most of its introduced range. Unfortunately, there's this paradox: when mosquito control works too well, it can become an easy target for budgetary cuts. And waning vector control efforts did result in the reemergence of Aedes aegypti throughout much of this region, as seen in this figure on the right, showing the distribution by 1998. Of course, wherever we have vector reemergence, the diseases have also eventually returned. As we see in these figures, the prevalence of severe dengue increased dramatically throughout Central and South America following the reestablishment of Aedes aegypti. The Ministerio de Salud Pública, or MSP, is the national public health agency in Ecuador. Aside from overseeing more typical public health issues, they also oversee surveillance and laboratory diagnostics for vector-borne diseases. This includes surveillance and testing not only for human cases, but also for surveillance of mosquito populations as well as delivering household-level vector control, such as the fogging application shown in this image. A branch of the MSP, the National Service of Control for Arthropod Vector Diseases, or SNEM, was the national level branch that coordinated vector control efforts for the country of Ecuador. But recently, changes in the administration led to its eventual dissolution, and now vector control activities have been shifted to local branches of the MSP in individual towns. Nevertheless, there are a wealth of surveillance data sets that were collected for routine activities by the SNEM that we can still access and leverage to answer other questions related to vector-borne disease transmission. With that in mind, the overarching goal of this dissertation was to leverage those pre-existing data sets from the MSP, using agency data secondarily to explore mosquito-borne diseases, their risk, and vector control activities in a specifically spatial context and at a variety of spatial scales. By applying geographic techniques to routine surveillance data, we can start to answer questions related to where vector control interventions may be needed. The first of the three studies that made up my dissertation was conducted at the national level, estimating the geographic distribution of Aedes aegypti throughout the entire country of Ecuador. Specifically, the objectives of this study were to use ecological niche modeling to model the current distribution of Aedes aegypti in the country, project the best model of current distribution to estimate potential future distributions of the mosquito, and then compare the models to assess potential changes or shifts in distributions. To meet these research objectives, I used a database of household larval mosquito surveys compiled by the MSP. These were surveys that were conducted to assess mosquito presence and larval abundance, conducted at the household level based on World Health Organization recommendations. Basically, technicians were sent out to individual households where they would check containers of standing water to look for presence of that aquatic larval stage of the mosquito shown here in this dipper. The MSP National Larval Survey operated from 2000 to 2012. Although this national data set was a massive undertaking by the part of the MSP, they visited individual households throughout the entire country for over a decade. There are still many areas in Ecuador that could not be sampled. But we can see how it would be useful for a public health agency to know risk of potential exposure to mosquitoes in those unsampled areas. And to do this, I used a technique called ecological niche modeling. Very briefly, this is a predictive technique that allows us to estimate potential habitat suitability in unsampled areas by taking records of species occurrence where we have documented a species as being present and relating that to continuous underlying environmental variables that are biologically meaningful to that species in some way, using those as inputs into an ENM algorithm and then getting the resulting model. For the ENM, I used the MSP larval surveillance dataset as my records of species occurrence. However, there was a slight issue that presented itself when I had access to the agency database. Because this was a household level survey, the agency aggregated individual surveys to the administrative centroid of a unit called Paroquia for purposes of de-identification. This means that 3,655 individual records were aggregated to just 340 unique points, which in itself is not necessarily problematic. But these paroquias have extremely high variability in their spatial resolution. On the coast of Ecuador, paroquias are typically very small in the area of around 2 kilometers square. However, when we go to the Amazon basin, paroquias can be extremely large, with many over 8,000 kilometers square in area. This severely limits the spatial resolution that we can use for modeling purposes, as we would be limited to that coarsest unit of resolution. And this would weaken the association between mosquito presence and environmental conditions, yielding models that are simply not very useful. To address this issue, I used an informed disaggregation approach with guidance from the MSP. We knew the number of surveillance years and the number of positive locations in a given paroquia, and we knew from the MSP that surveys were limited to cities, villages, and towns. So we were able to reassign points from the centroids of paroquias to the areas of human habitation that the agency would have sampled. This yielded 478 unique locations, so not a huge increase over those initial 350 points, but I was able to achieve a spatial resolution of 5 kilometers, which is an incredible gain over the 8,000 kilometers that I was originally limited to. The environmental variables that I used as the other data input for this modeling process were the 19 bioclimatic variables from WorldClim. These are interpolated surfaces that provide data on elevation and various measures of temperature and precipitation that we know have biological relevance to determining habitat suitability for mosquitoes. Additionally, because this is an anthropophilic mosquito that does very well in urban environments, I also used the Socioeconomic Data and Application Center gridded population of the world, a data set of human population density that in this case I used as a proxy for urban or built environments. These environmental data layers were used at a 5 kilometer resolution to match the spatial resolution that I was able to recover in the larval mosquito data set. So the larval occurrence points and environmental variables were used as data inputs for the genetic algorithm for rule set production implemented in the program Desktop Guard. Briefly, the algorithm generates mathematical rules that define species presence based on the underlying environmental conditions. 75% of the larval data were randomly selected to run several experiments in GARP, and 25% of the data was withheld to generate accuracy metrics for the purposes of model ranking and selection. This figure shows the model output for the current distribution of Aedes aegypti throughout Ecuador, showing the agreement among the top 10 models from the highest ranked GARP experiment of 200 models. This estimated distribution shown here largely aligns with the current public health advisories from the MSP, where areas of low elevation along the western coast and the Amazon basin that have high precipitation and warmer temperatures are generally considered to be at risk for mosquito-borne disease transmission. Conspicuously, we notice this area that is not predicted to be suitable at all, running from north to south throughout the country of Ecuador. And this is an area that coincides with the Andes mountain range, one of the tallest mountain ranges in the world that is generally regarded to be protected against exposure to mosquitoes, largely in part due to its elevation and arid, cool mountain climate. So now that we have the current model for Aedes aegypti distribution, we can then project that model to the year 2050 under 3 general circulation models, or GCMs, models of future climate. In addition to the 3 climate models that I selected, I also ran models for these 3 climate models under the 4 representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. These are scenarios of greenhouse gas emission change, roughly estimating the possible effects of climate change. They range from RCP 2.6, which accounts for a scenario where considerable international mitigation efforts have been taken to reduce carbon emissions, to RCP 8.5, which would represent a worst case scenario. These are the resulting models of Aedes aegypti habitat suitability in the year 2050 under those 2 extreme RCP scenarios. And what we see is that regardless of climate model and regardless of climate change scenario, much of coastal Ecuador in the west still is predicted to remain suitable for the presence of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. While if we look across models, large geographic areas in the Amazon basin are projected to have range contraction, so areas that are no longer suitable for presence of mosquitoes. Combining this model output so that we can view consensus across models, we see that much of the currently suitable habitat for Aedes aegypti is predicted to remain so by the year 2050. While much of the Amazon basin is predicted to become unsuitable. The large range contractions like this of a vector are potentially advantageous to the public health department, because this would represent areas where the people living in these areas are no longer exposed to presence of mosquitoes and consequently risk of transmission. And these represent also areas where the MSP could reallocate or shift resources away to conserve scarce health resources. Oh no. So this, at a glance, looks like a major win for the health agency in the future if half the country becomes unsuitable for mosquitoes. I also want to call your attention to the areas in red for both RCPs on either side of the Andes mountain range, representing the peripheral areas of transitioning elevation in the foothills of the Andes. These are areas where the predicted suitability models agree on range expansion. So areas that are currently unsuitable for the presence of mosquitoes that could become suitable in the future. So again, this looks like most of the area is contracting and a small rate area is expanding or becoming more suitable. So this is a win. But looking at these results in the context of where people in Ecuador live, we see that the Amazon region has extremely low population density relative to the rest of the country. And although these areas of predicted expansion along the Andes mountain range in the foothills are a smaller geographic area, they do coincide with areas that are more densely populated. So aside from what this means is that under current population estimates, there are between over 9,000 to just under 13,000 additional people that could be put at risk at some point in the future to exposure to this mosquito vector. And projecting population estimates to the year 2050, we can see from over 15,000 to over 21,000 additional people that could be put at risk. And aside from just the numbers, these also represent populations that may be at a baseline elevated risk for mosquito-borne diseases compared to communities in low-lying areas, such as the coast, that because these people are currently living in protected areas and they may not have knowledge of mosquito control tactics or personal protective behaviors. Although this is information that can help inform agency decision making, there are still limitations to this research that should be addressed. Although 5 kilometers is a much finer spatial resolution than what was in the original data set of larval index points from the MSP, this is still a rather low spatial resolution for any type of targeted intervention. 5 kilometers does not tell you where within a given area of risk you should spray or treat or try to intervene with mosquito control. We also cannot account for anthropogenic influences in the distributions of mosquitoes with these models. We know that this mosquito is closely associated with human habitation, and anthropogenic influences, such as the creation of microclimate through urban areas or water storage behaviors at the household level, could create refugia or areas of pockets of suitable habitat within a larger ecologically unsuitable area. We also can't account for the possible influence of other mosquito species that could establish in Ecuador, such as this secondary vector of dengue fever shown here, the Asian tiger mosquito Aedes albopictus. And there are some interesting competition dynamics where in other locations where these two species coexist. So the expansion of Aedes aegypti distribution over time could create new areas of disease risk. And knowing that our ecological niche models for current conditions do reflect the current epidemiologic case data, this provides some tools that will enable our partners and policymakers in Ecuador to anticipate future changes in exposure risk, which could be useful in expanding surveillance efforts and educational outreach efforts to those areas that could be potentially at risk, helping with new areas to inform risk and surveillance planning. These results have already been shared with the public health agencies in Ecuador so that they can be considered in future outreach and surveillance efforts. The ecological niche modeling study was conducted at the national level, and this next study focuses now on a single city in Ecuador's southern coast, assessing the delivery of mosquito control services in the city of Machala. The objectives of this study were to assess locations of mosquito spray hubs throughout Machala, Ecuador, the costs associated with the delivery of services, and then find optimized service delivery routes from spray hubs to individual neighborhoods, as well as exploring alternate service deployment locations under different management priorities. A little bit of background on the study site, Machala. This is a coastal city in El Oro province located on the southern coast of Ecuador near the border of Peru. It has a population of over 240,000 people and making it the 4th most populated city in the country. And historically, aside from high population, Machala has also contended with a high incidence of dengue virus, as well as other mosquito-borne diseases such as emerging chikungunya and Zika. Because of this, the vector control operations are very important in Machala, and the MSP delivers household control services where the agency reacts passively to surveillance cases, and mosquito control interventions are triggered by incoming dengue cases that are reported through local medical centers. ENEC, the Ecuadorian National Census and Statistics Center, provided data on the road network in Machala and shapefiles of the barrios or neighborhoods, which can be used as data inputs for transportation analyses. Data that could be used as weighting factors in the analyses of this project were also made available, but from the most recent national census, which was conducted in 2010. The new census was scheduled for this year, but we'll see what happens with that. The MSP provided dengue outbreak data for this study, as well as the 2 locations of the currently active mosquito control hubs shown on this map as black squares. And these are locations from which the MSP delivers its vector control services. And the MSP also provided the locations of 8 medical sub-centers shown on this map as red crosses. These were locations where mosquito control services were formally deployed from, largely as part of a national malaria eradication campaign that was disbanded around the time that the SNEM was disbanded. Nevertheless, these medical subcenters were outfitted to deliver vector control services and could easily be reactivated if there is reason to do so. So in order to optimize the most efficient service delivery routes, so what route along the transportation network should we take to efficiently deliver mosquito control services, we borrowed methods from transportation geography using ArcMap's network analyst toolset. The optimized routes were estimated via modification of Dijkstra's algorithm. Very briefly, Dijkstra's algorithm finds the shortest travel routes between origins, in this case mosquito control hubs, and destinations, set as the centroids of the barrios or neighborhoods in Machala. We know from speaking to technicians in Machala that the service teams can only treat 25 houses at a time before they have to make a return trip to a hub to refill their backpack sprayers. So finding optimized routes isn't simply about finding the shortest route for a one-way trip. These are routes that spray technicians have to take repeatedly to treat an entire neighborhood. So part of the costs that we wanted to assume were fuel consumption costs. And unfortunately, these had to be set as constant estimates. So I pulled average cost of gasoline from World Bank and estimated the standard pickup truck fuel efficiency that reasonably estimates the type of gear that technicians are actively using in the field. This figure shows the optimized travel routes from the two currently active spray hubs in Machala. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that the shortest routes are centrally located near those hubs, and that the relative cost of access, in this case, distance traveled along the road network, increases for neighborhoods in a radiating fashion, with the peripheral neighborhoods in the city of Machala having the highest cost, in this case, travel distance. When we apply our estimates of fuel consumption to estimate the number of trips needed to treat each household in a given neighborhood once, we end up with this figure. And again, we see that the cost of accessing neighborhoods is generally the cheapest or most efficient in the central area of the city where you're close to those spray hubs. And the cost of access generally increases for neighborhoods near the city's outer limits. So now that we have a way of assessing the general efficiency or the cost of service delivery for the hubs that are currently active, we can now explore alternate service locations. Trying to answer this question, what are the best locations for service deployment chosen from a set of candidate locations and under different management goals? To do this, I ran location allocation analyses using ArcMap's network analyst that provides a framework for testing combinations of different locations for different weights. Being able to weight optimized routes is important because what public health practitioners consider the best location for service delivery is completely dependent upon agency goals, and these may change over time. For these analyses, I used 4 different weighting factors that were chosen to represent different management priorities in generating these models. Weighting strictly by distance to find the most efficient travel routes and minimize driving costs. Weighting by population, a scenario that would prioritize the number of people being served. Weighting by housing conditions, a factor that we know is associated with dengue risk from other studies conducted in Machala. And then weighting directly by incoming dengue outbreak data. I want to briefly discuss one of those weighting factors in a little more detail, the housing condition index. Housing condition index is an aggregate variable that combines the general quality of housing structure, such as having roofs, walls, flooring, and windows that are in good repair. Scores low on this index indicate good quality housing. such as this image in the top corner, while housing with a high index score indicates housing that may be in disrepair or constructed from materials that are not able to exclude mosquitoes, such as the caño or cane housing shown in this lower image. Again, housing with high HCI scores has been identified as a risk factor for dengue in other studies conducted in coastal Ecuador, where the housing in disrepair can permit access of mosquito vectors to the household, as well as areas where excess debris may be providing that habitat and ample sites for mosquito production. When we view the distribution of the HCI in Machala, we quickly notice that housing with the highest HCI scores indicating poor condition housing are located on the periphery of the city. So these are areas that not only have the highest cost of access because they are on the longest routes for mosquito control delivery, but they also have some of the most vulnerable housing conditions in the city. Given what we know about the potential association between housing quality and risk of exposure to mosquitoes, these outer neighborhoods could represent targets for proactive management strategies. So what I mean by a proactive management strategy is targeting areas that could be vulnerable to dengue outbreaks before those outbreaks occur based on factors of social or ecological risk, in this case, the housing condition index. If we compare this to reactive mosquito control, which responds to incoming dengue cases detected through the surveillance network, as is shown in this red panel on the right, we see that the highest reported dengue from the year 2010 at least was reported in more centrally located neighborhoods throughout the city. And there's actually no dengue reported in some of those neighborhoods that we would expect to be more vulnerable based on HCI alone. Now, this probably in reality does not mean that there really is no dengue here. This is likely driven by underreporting of cases in these peripheral neighborhoods. Also, this isn't to say that one strategy is inherently better than another, but rather this really illustrates the difference that management choices and priorities can have on where targeted areas are located. So here are the results of the location allocation analysis. And as we see, weighting factors do indeed impact the location for the most efficient service deployment sites. Interestingly, the easternmost currently active spray hub was selected as an efficient location for service deployment, regardless of weighting factor. However, the ideal secondary service location was shifted to a medical subcenter west of the currently active spray hub. And this is weighting by optimal delivery, weighting our optimal delivery routes by travel distance, population served, or by reported dengue incidents. And when we weight by the housing condition index, we see that the optimal location for that secondary hub is shifted even further to the west, where we expect to see poorer quality housing. In either case, selecting an alternate hub location reduced the estimated fuel costs associated with service delivery by 9.2% when we weighted by HCI to 12.7% weighting by any of these other factors. So the efficient delivery of public health vector control is challenging no matter where you are, and the cost of service is closely tied to those management strategies. Unfortunately, the spatial resolution of these models, where we can optimize delivery routes only to the center of neighborhoods, would still be insufficient at this point for planning real-world driving routes that technicians could use. I wouldn't take any of these maps and hand them to a technician and say, here's your new driving route. Nevertheless, this modeling framework provides an extremely useful way of guiding management decisions through easy visualization of potential risks, and provides a tool for scenario building that can be used by public health practitioners. As we see in this study, the current mosquito control hubs may not be the ideal combination of choices for meeting agency goals, depending on what those agency goals are. This is a framework that clearly has implications well beyond Ecuador and could be used to benefit any agency that's tasked with overseeing regular mosquito control operations. The final study that I'm talking about today was also focused in Machala, and instead of using neighborhoods as the unit of analysis, we once again adopt a finer spatial resolution, assessing social and ecological and surveillance indicators for dengue risk at individual households. And so the objectives of this study were to identify factors that were associated with the presence of female Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in households, factors that were associated with the household presence of dengue cases, and then to try to answer this question, is household mosquito presence an indicator of dengue cases? The data for this study were made available through a collaborative epidemiological surveillance study with the MSP and Upstate Medical University, where a household cluster study was conducted in Machala from the years 2014 to 2016. Index cases with confirmed dengue infections were recruited to the study from local medical centers. And in addition to these index households, up to 4 additional households were recruited from within 200 meters of each index house. Teams of local MSP technicians administered survey questionnaires to the heads of the households of enrolled households, collecting data on physical housing conditions, socioeconomic status, and knowledge and practices regarding mosquito prevention. At the same time, Aedes aegypti mosquitoes were collected from within households with backpack aspirators, as shown in this image. Additionally, diagnostic testing for active dengue infection was offered to participating households who chose to take part in that portion of the study. And what we see, or what we what we ended up with, was 443 households in 91 sampling clusters that had the household survey questionnaire administered, as well as being surveyed for the presence of Aedes aegypti, and 141 households in 33 sampling clusters that were surveyed for dengue infection, additionally surveyed for dengue infection status. I do want to point out that these data were at the household level, but for the purposes of de-identification, I've aggregated the housing clusters to the barrios used in the previous study, just to show the spatial extent of sampling throughout the city. Here are some selected results of the housing survey that I wanted to highlight. Nearly a third of surveyed households in Machala were in what we would consider good condition, but several did have features that were known to be associated with mosquito production in the region, such as presence of standing water, adjacency to abandoned housing, and presence of a patio. Municipal services, which can serve to reduce mosquito habitat around homes, was generally high across households. Yet, frequent interruptions in water service, which can drive water storage behaviors that produce habitat for mosquitoes, did occur in over half of the households. Most of the heads of households were employed, with few earning less than minimum wage, and we found that water storage practices were common, and less so was the use of larvicide and abatement strategies to control for larval mosquitoes. Aedes aegypti mosquitoes were present in 54% of the houses surveyed in the study. So the variables collected in the household survey were used as explanatory variables for either the outcome of female Aedes aegypti presence or household dengue presence. This choice of statistical modeling framework was contingent upon the data structure, though. So in other words, I wanted to ensure that this clustered study design did not have any undue influence on the model results. I used the interclass correlation coefficient statistic, which indicated that the study design did not influence variance in the data. And I ended up using multi-model selection with logistic regression to perform model searches on household Aedes aegypti presence and dengue presence, respectively. The resultant models were ranked with Akaike's information criterion corrected for small sample size, and I checked models for violations of statistical assumption with Lorentz I, and model stability using a K condition number. Here are the model results for dengue presence. There were 26 models for dengue presence that were found within 2 AIC units of the top model. And we see that housing in good condition is negatively associated with dengue presence. So this is a protective factor against household dengue. Whereas houses made of cane, adjacency to abandoned households, shaded patios, head of households that are employed, and air conditioned were all positively associated with the outcome of dengue presence. Interestingly, mosquitoes were not a predictor for household dengue in many of the top models, and the models for female Aedes aegypti presence were quite poor with high instability and small effect sizes. So not models that we would want to reliably use to inform policy. The identification of good housing condition as a protective factor against dengue does align with other work conducted in coastal Ecuador, where housing condition was among the top predictors of dengue incidence. Factors that were positively associated with dengue presence represent potential leverage points that could be exploited by the MSP for mosquito control interventions, such as targeting cane housing or housing that has shaded patios. There were two counterintuitive relationships that were identified in this study that are very interesting. One being the positive association between air conditioning and dengue. Air conditioning is largely regarded as a protective factor against household mosquitoes and mosquito-borne disease transmission in many systems, owing to the fact that if you have climate control, you're not going to have your windows and doors open to ventilate your house, and you're going to prevent mosquitoes from entering the household. So this one was a bit confusing. But in speaking with our field site manager in Machala, they indicated that this actually made sense because air conditioning can be expensive to run. So households with air conditioning in Machala may run the air conditioning during part of the day, say at night, but still rely on open doors and windows for ventilation during the day. Head of household employment is also a factor that is typically associated with reduced incidence of dengue, as the head of household being employed is typically a marker for better socioeconomic status, and it correlates with better housing conditions that are protective against mosquitoes. However, although this was a fine resolution study, we did this at households. Running these collecting mosquito data and dengue infant status just at households is really only capturing a portion of the social and ecological system of transmission at that level. In short, we have no data on potential infective mosquito bites that people may be receiving if they leave the house to travel, interact with other areas, or may receive at their place of employment. So this represents an area for further investigation. The overall lack of association between mosquito presence and dengue could mean that this is not a very good surveillance indicator in a city with hyperendemic dengue transition like Machala. And this is important because although entomological surveillance does require much fewer resources and is very cost effective compared to mitigating an actual outbreak, it still does require resources which can be limited in certain areas. But it is worth noting that Aedes aegypti can be difficult to sample via backpack aspiration, as was used in this study. So this perhaps calls for the use of alternate surveillance technologies in that city before we completely write off the utility of mosquito surveillance. Finally, I want to briefly touch on some of the impacts that this dissertation will have. The point of doing all this research actually was not so I could get a PhD. Due to the applied nature of this research, it was very important that the findings of these studies were made accessible and in a timely manner so that they could be used by the public health agency in Ecuador to improve community health. In that vein, the first two studies of this dissertation have already been published in peer-reviewed journals, and the third one is currently in review. The results of these studies are already being shared with the MSP, and our team has made conscious efforts to ensure that the research is as accessible as possible to our partners. So some of the steps that we have taken to ensure accessibility is translating many of our press releases into Spanish. And recently, some of this research was included in part of a larger Spanish language synthesis paper that was published this year in an Ecuadorian journal. Collectively, these studies do advance our understanding of vector distributions in Ecuador, provide a means of critically reviewing vector control service and delivery, and fill crucial gaps in knowledge regarding localized factors that may be related to dengue presence. Collectively, this work goes to show how applying intersecting methods from geography can greatly expand the utility of data collected via pre-existing surveillance networks. So this work was part of a massive collaborative effort and could not have taken place without the incredible guidance and insight from my committee, including my advisor, Dr. Sadie Ryan, and the rest of my committee members, Dr. Jason Blackburn, Dr. Leon Mao, and Dr. Nathan Burkett-Cadena. Dr. Anna Stewart Ibarra, who was formerly at Upstate Medical University, was a frequent collaborator who offered much guidance on many of these projects, as well as the rest of our team in Ecuador, who collected collected all of the data for these studies, as well as provided insight for interpretation of the results. And finally, to my QDEC lab group, who have had to listen to me give different iterations of these talks many, many times by this point. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Kat. We have some time for questions from anyone hanging out here who would like to ask questions. If you feel like we're not hearing you, you can say so in the chat. And if everyone's a bit shy this morning after that excellent talk, that's fine too.
Hey, Kat, this is Nathan here.
Hi.
Hey, nice talk. I really enjoyed that. Very, very attractive and informative. So, so you've shown a potential range contraction of Aedes aegypti in the Amazonian region over different climate change scenarios. So what about other vector-borne diseases that would occur in that area? How do you think that those same climate scenarios might impact other vector-borne diseases?
That is an excellent question. So first off, I'm going to preface by saying these are correlative models, so I did not really use these models to investigate possible mechanisms other than pulling out which environmental variables were used to make the model rules, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what the actual mechanism of the effect is having on the vector. That said, range contractions of mosquitoes, as far as I could tell for Ecuador, are from two things. Either it's getting too hot or there's some shift in hydrology. And the variables that seem to change a lot by the year 2050 in the Amazon do seem more precipitation related. So in that case, I could see how that would affect other mosquito vectors more than other arthropod vectors that may not be as dependent on water. That said, some of the areas of contraction were because the temperatures were getting incredibly hot. And if it's too hot to where it's no longer suitable for mosquitoes because it's passing some physiological threshold, I would suspect that that would also be eliminated without knowing what the upper thermal limits are for other things that are not mosquitoes. I would suspect that that could perhaps be limiting ecologically to other ectothermic arthropods.
Okay, thank you.
Could you talk a little bit more about those other vectors? So outside of Egypti, what could happen? I'm thinking about Albopictus in particular for this region.
Well, Albopictus, I actually ran out of time and had to cut my bit on that, so this is great. So Aedes albopictus is not currently a species of major medical concern in Ecuador because asterisk, it's not there. It's been detected in the city of Guayaquil, so a port city, around 2016, I think it was. But as of yet, there's no indication or that it's spreading beyond that port city. But we know that Aedes albopictus is incredibly invasive in other areas, including other areas of Latin America. The reason this could change those projected distributions of Aedes aegypti are for two reasons. One, there are interesting competition dynamics between the two species in some portions of their range. For example, in Florida, where they both co-occur, if Aedes albopictus mates with an Aedes aegypti mosquito, it sterilizes the Aedes aegypti mosquito, so they have a little bit of a competitive edge. The other reason Aedes albopictus could be problematic, especially if we're talking about potential vulnerable populations in these transitional areas of elevation, is that Aedes albopictus is a more temperate mosquito. It's tolerant of cooler temperatures, and it's tolerant of cooler temperatures for longer periods of time. So in theory, it could go even further up the mountain than Aedes aegypti could, which would completely change that estimated area of risk.
I'm not seeing any further hands being raised or questions, so I think I will now ask that the public portion of this defense be finished.